Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Katya Schwenk. She's a journalist based in Phoenix, writing for The Lever, and again, gives me an opportunity to encourage everybody to go and sign up for a subscription for The Lever. They do great journalism over there. We've had folks on for The Lever and a couple of things, and Katya, your work on this Boeing stuff has been really great. You've been on this beat now for weeks, I guess, and more. Just give us a little bit of the backstory that brought us to the point where people, started to sort of like acknowledge more broadly that there is a problem with Boeing. But I guess maybe this acknowledgement may have come in the last week of the Trump administration too. But just give us that background.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the reason that Boeing, of course, has been in the headlines, mostly for the last few weeks, has been that really shocking incident on an Alaska Airlines flight, right, in which a door panel blew out shortly after takeoff, mid-flight over Portland, Oregon, leaving the escaping hole in the side of a Boeing plane. Obviously a really shocking moment. It seems basically miraculous that there were no serious injuries on that flight. And I think, in a sense, it's an isolated incident. There's an ongoing investigation trying to figure out what's caused it. But I think what we have tried to do, and what I think this incident has done, is really brought further attention to these ongoing issues at Boeing that have been ongoing for years. As you alluded to, Boeing is still sort of dealing with the fallout from, the devastating fatal crashes in 2018 and 2019. I think right now we're seeing new questions being raised about what happened there.
Now, I'm obligated to ask you this question. In your reporting, have you found DEI as a big problem for this? Is it really like I'm half joking. No, I'm 100% joking. But
there's no evidence that is at all at issue here.
Right. So in 2018, 2019, just remind us of what happened, because it does, for the most part, center around the MAX 737s for the most part. The ones that we had in 2018 or 2019 had to do with the software, had to do with the development of the plane. That was also sort of a function of changes that were happening at airports, is my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, Boeing at that time was rolling out the MAX, sort of new generation of the 737s. It installed a new sort of flight control system, in my understanding, to correct sort of an engineering issue, and to bring the plane's nose down mid-flight. It was the system. Pilots were not well trained on that system. What emerged from federal investigations into Boeing's rollout of this new flight control system was that Boeing had sort of hidden the full scope of it from federal regulators, leading to pilots not being fully trained on how this sort of corrective system worked in certain instances. And there was, a faulty sensor that caused the system to activate, and which then caused two planes to nosedive, and it was not able to be stopped by the pilots, causing these, really, really devastating, tragic crashes.
And so, to be clear, there were engineering fixes. In other words, like physical I guess to put it in the context of computers, hardware fixes that could have been done in the design of the plane that would have made it far less susceptible to pilot error, and also far less susceptible to needing to take it out of the hands of pilots. They tried to patch it essentially with software, as opposed to fixing sort of like the engineering, the actual construction of the airplane. And the speculation that they did this was because to fix it with hardware is going to be more expensive than fixing it with software. and you're going to have to hire more people to construct these things and to retrofit the planes. And that cuts into shareholder value, and nobody wants that, except for the people who want safe planes. So in the wake of those two accidents, what happened in the last weeks of the Trump administration?
Sure. So, just before Biden took office, there was a lot of speculation at that time of whether, Boeing was going to face any criminal charges as a result of what happened. Again, there had been this investigation that, indicated that Boeing was more aware of these problems and had sort of hidden them to an extent from federal regulators so that Boeing would not have to delay its rollout with, additional training for pilots, right? That's sort of the narrative that has emerged in investigations after the fact. And so there's a lot of speculation at that time of whether, Boeing was going to face criminal charges for this, right? The company itself. And in the very final days of the Trump administration, literally days before Biden took office, the Department of Justice brought a single charge of fraud against Boeing as a result of what happened, as a result of, the fatal crashes. But at the same time that it charged Boeing with this, with fraud, it also entered into a deal with Boeing, which had been negotiated essentially in secret, that allowed Boeing it's called a deferred prosecution agreement, which essentially means that after a few years, since the deal was signed, but if Boeing comes into compliance, if it pays, a criminal penalty, prosecutors would agree to drop the charges. And the distinct, I should say, from a plea deal in which, Boeing would actually have to plead guilty, there'd be negotiations and more judicial oversight. In this case, from the very beginning, from the day the charge was brought against Boeing, there was sort of this agreement that Boeing would not face prosecution. But, as I've written about what happened with the Alaska Airlines flight, with some of these issues we're seeing at Boeing suppliers, they are calling this deal into question.
Well, I mean, they're calling it into question, I would imagine now, of course, because it's affecting people in America, right? Like,
who's the they that's calling it into question?
Yeah, well, that question as well. And I am curious about like what your reporting found about maybe some differences in how the approach was taken because of the fact that this was in Ethiopia and Indonesia.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think I think because of the fact that this was, I think the fact that this occurred outside of the U.S. In these countries, was absolutely a reason why, Boeing did not face the kind of criminal charges that we might have expected from a flight in which 346 Americans died, right? And I'm sorry, your other question, who they is calling into question, the legal teams for the victims of these families, or the families of these victims, have been pushing against this deal since the moment it was signed back in January 2021. And in the wake of what happened with this flight in January, they are calling this deal into question once again.
And what's happening on that front? Like, I mean, how does a deal like that get rescinded? Is it something that the DOJ can unilaterally do, or does this something, does it have to go to court? Does it get tested after the deal is over? I mean, what's the mechanism to question that deal and hold Boeing to account for, what really looks like corners being cut to hit certain numbers in the C-suite?
Sure. Yeah, so the deal was signed in January 2021. There was a 3-year period after that in which Boeing was supposed to come into compliance with fraud laws, institute, a program, an ethics program, sort of the general, corporate compliance stuff we see in these kinds of deals. So Boeing had 3 years to do that and also to pay this fine. And that 3 years expired on January 7th, with 2 days after the Alaska Airlines incident. And when that deal expired, it began the review period in which federal prosecutors now are meeting and we assume, and deciding, did Boeing indeed come into compliance with the terms of this deal? That review period ends in June. It's sort of expected that they will say that Boeing came into compliance. That's what, lawyers for the families of victims of the flight crashes told me that's what they expect to happen. But, it is the U.S. Department of Justice, it's the Biden administration and federal prosecutors that have sole discretion, essentially, over whether or not to drop the case against Boeing. The families of the victims, the flight crashes, their loved ones are asking for a judge to just declare the deal as null entirely because it was negotiated secretly without consulting the victims, which they say was against the law. That it is possible that could happen, that a judge could intervene, but barring that, the federal prosecutors really have sole discretion.
There's no appealing. I mean, it seems like what a coincidence. I understand that, the argument would probably be something to the effect of like, oh, well, these, the door came off because of a different problem. And so therefore we had rectified that problem. It's just that we had another different problem as opposed to taking like another step backwards and going like, hey, you've got a broader building of airplanes problem rather than a specific engineering problem here. And we've also seen that like it seems that the FAA has had to step in and go like, we're not going to allow or questioning the whole self-inspection thing because of the nature. I mean, that to me also seems like an indication. I get the idea that the plaintiffs, that being the families of people who died, could argue that this deal was entered into from the beginning was illicit because of the mechanism and the means in which the deal was constructed. But are you saying that there's absolutely no mechanism in which to appeal the review by the DOJ that they had become in compliance over the course of those 3 years?
My understanding, I'm no lawyer, so, I would want to talk to, experts about that. But, my understanding is the terms of the deal lay out pretty clearly that it is the U.S. Department of Justice that has discretion. And when I spoke with, attorneys representing these families and asked them that same question, they told me that, unlike a plea deal in which a judge could say, this is far too easy on the defendant, this is giving Boeing, an easy way out. DPAs, deferred prosecution agreements, are just not subject to that same kind of, judicial oversight. Which really raises the problem. But, the other aspect of this that I'll mention is the fact that at a key Boeing supplier, Spirit AeroSystems, there have been allegations by former employees of fraud at that supplier around sort of these manufacturing defects. And, this part of Boeing's agreement part of Boeing's end of the deal was to make sure that, not only Boeing itself, but its subcontractors were complying with, fraud laws. And so, in the wake of these allegations at Spirit, I think there is an argument to be made, that maybe Boeing was not properly doing so.
I want to talk about the relationship with Spirit and Boeing, because it's not just, these aren't just some random contractor. Spirit was actually spun off from Boeing, and is I don't know if it's completely at arm's length from Boeing in that respect, and I want to talk about that in a second. But is there just staying on that deferred prosecution agreement? Is there any indication that and I would imagine this would have to happen in the Senate as opposed to the House, because the House is too busy doing, God knows what. But is there any indication that there's like any type of like congressional oversight hearings that are contemplated for this? I don't know, the subcommittee on transportation or something? Because it sounds like the only way that this review can be that the trajectory of this review can be altered would be political pressure. Prosecutors go through this all the time. I'm going to make a plea deal, or I can't make a plea deal because this is too hot of a potato. I mean, is there any indication that there's like any type of like congressional review in the offing?
Yeah, I can't speak to whether there's going to be, congressional review of the DPA specifically. I know that there has been, interest somewhat by the Biden administration in reviewing Boeing. Pete Buttigieg said that he was going to launch a broader investigation into Boeing. I know that's something some members of Congress have said, they want to see too. But I think we're going to need to see far more pressure to alter the course of a deal like this, which was really struck with the intention of, simply dropping it after 3 years.
Tell us about the relationship between Boeing and Spirit. I mean, this is, and not to be confused with Spirit Airlines, this is a manufacturer of planes called Spirit. Tell us about that relationship.
Yeah, no, I think this relationship is so emblematic of, what has happened to Boeing over the last few decades, right? As you said, Spirit AeroSystems, this is a publicly traded company, not the same, household name level as Boeing, but, a very significant company that employs thousands of people. Spirit AeroSystems was once Boeing's Wichita division. It was once, an important part of Boeing itself. But in 2005, Boeing sold Spirit AeroSystems off to a private equity company, which then, did what private equity companies do, poured a lot of money into Spirit, in the hopes of getting, big returns. Spirit quickly sort of scaled up its operations and began, producing far more planes. And somewhere along the way has gotten to this point where now it's no longer part of Boeing. Just like many other aspects of the supply chain, Boeing has outsourced, this part of its manufacturing to other companies. Boeing has less ability to oversee Spirit. Spirit has seen very serious manufacturing issues. We've written about allegations in a federal lawsuit that say that employees at Spirit were told that, they could lose their jobs if they correctly reported the amount of manufacturing defects that they were seeing in the production process. And Spirit has been a headache for Boeing for years. We've seen these sort of a series of high profile scandals from, defects in Spirit's production. And so, I think the relationship is important and really is sort of emblematic, as I said, of what has happened to Boeing over the years.
Will you explain to, and this may be outside of your portfolio, but when a Boeing spins off a Spirit, who makes money? Like, who does that benefit in that? It's like, why does Boeing, I mean, clearly, like, the companies, like, they're relying on Spirit, they're making the planes. Like, why does a Boeing do that?
Yeah, I think in this case, we saw Boeing make quite a lot of money from this deal. Which then, I think it was beneficial for Boeing at that time, wanted to, get a quick influx of cash, right, for its shareholders. And at the same time, now Spirit is a really valuable asset for the private equity company, which is the Onex Group, I believe, which then made, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, several $100 million over years from its initial investment of Spirit into the point where it, divested or lost all ownership stake in the company. It's sort of what we are typically seeing is the shareholders here are the ones really making money off these kinds of deals.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear with this. And when we say shareholders, I would imagine some of the biggest shareholders who got paid off were the executives, the top executives at Boeing, the board of directors, and then some big shareholders there ended up making this money. And it's not like Boeing needed it because they needed capital to, invest in a different type of plane. They basically have a monopoly. Yeah. They had bought their only competitor, I guess, around that time, right? McDonnell Douglas. And so there was no competition. The U.S. government, represents what slice of their business?
I'm actually not sure. Yeah.
I think it's close to 50% or 40%. I mean, so this is not like a cash poor company. This
Right.
was just, we can make cash, spin this off. We don't have to worry about their construction standards. So what's the next step? Like, what do we anticipate? What's the next story you're going to be writing about this, I guess? And what do you anticipate is going to happen next?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually today that the federal investigators are expected to release their initial report into what happened, their preliminary findings into what happened in the Alaska plane. In terms of the Boeing deal, though, which is something we're going to be watching closely. Like I said, it's kind of a waiting game right now. We're waiting to see whether or not federal prosecutors meet with the families of victims of the flight crashes, whether or not the Biden administration says anything about the deal. And, in the coming months, we're going to see what happens with that case. And, we're going to learn a little bit more, I think, about, what happened with the Alaska Airlines plane.
Katya Schwenk, journalist based in Phoenix, writing for The Lever, which I can't encourage people enough to go and check out. David Sirota started this, I don't know how long ago it was, a year or two ago, and but it's been a great source of journalism like this. We will put links to at least I've got, 4 or 5 of your pieces just over the past 5 or 6 weeks on this. People can catch up and find out about this. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And thank you for your work.
Thanks for having me.